Hi, everyone. Welcome to Room 2, our policy track. My name is Andrew Bradley. I'm Policy Director with Prosperity Indiana. I'm here to welcome you as well as support and facilitate this session, although this session really belongs to our presenters. We are fortunate to have both April DeSimone of Trahan Architects and Amy Nelson of the Fair Housing Center of Central Indiana with us today. I encourage you to ask questions in the Q&A feature throughout the presentation, as well as interact with your peers in the chat feature. There is an overview of this session as well as bios in that program, so I'm not going to take our time now, but I will leave it to our speakers to introduce themselves as much as they want. So let me turn it over to April and Amy.
Good morning, Andrew. How are you?
Good, good. Thank you for joining us today.
This is very, very grateful to Prosperity Indiana, as well as all the participants and Dr. Wilson's comments this morning. It really kicked us off and set a tone for what we're going to share with today. I was under the impression that Amy was starting, so my apologies for that, for just the little lag here. Let me just bring up my presentation. Can you all just give me a verbal okay that you can see my screen?
I can see it, and when I expand the upper right-hand corner, that's when your slides will go full screen for me.
Okay. Wonderful. Again, I really think the energy that Dr. Wilson grounded this conversation that we're about to have today, really centering it on what was his view and belief of this ideology of democracy, has really informed my understanding as a principal at Trahan Architects and as a co-founder of a platform that Trahan Architects is launching called Designing for Democracy. This really goes back to, again, when we get up every day, how does democracy come into our face, show up? What is the lived reality for many of us? And again, at a very, very early age, this was my built environment. This is the neighborhood I grew up in. This informed from the time that I got up to go to school and back and pledged allegiance in between, what did life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness mean for my family, for my neighborhood, for my community, for my friends? How do we get to these situations where we look around and we see such carnage or such disinvestment or inequities? Where does this begin? Where does it start? How does it manifest? And again, this is really what has begun to inform not only my view or those in my circle, but I think it's a growing practice back to highlight what is the agency as spatial practitioners, because we all are. But in doing this deeper dive and understanding, I start to arrive at what are the systems of the built environment. And again, just highlighting what Dr. Wilson said, these are very interconnected conditions. And when we look at systems change or wicked problems, what is at the root that's causing them? It really is the impetus behind looking at how systems of the built environment show up. How do we interrogate the implicit and invisible narratives of space? What does inequity actually mean for the different demographics or populations? And how does inequity not just only show up in the communities that most of us are working in, but what is the greater indictment to this concept of democracy of we the people? When we have thought about how systems, again, inform the way we as humans forget about the social constructs that have occurred, are navigating or meeting what we need. So when we look at, again, systems of the built environment, We look at infrastructure. We look at who influences infrastructure. We look at education. We look at a myriad of conditions that, again, really create the conditions of what we talk about of equity, healing, and justice. Sorry, I'm having difficulty with the slides. I don't know if it's this. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm very sorry for the confusion. Amy, I think it's, if you can jump in and start your presentation, there's something wrong with the presentation on my end, and I need to troubleshoot what's going on. So my apologies for that.
No problem. I'm happy to jump in, and I will share my screen, and we will get us started here today. So, and you should be able to see my PowerPoint right now. So just very quickly here is my contact information. My name is Amy Nelson, and I'm the Executive Director of the Fair Housing Center of Central Indiana. I'm going to move through these opening slides a little bit. We tend to put some opening slides in case our PowerPoint presentations are handed out, which I think this one might be. Need to preface, nothing is legal advice. I'm not an attorney. This is for just general informational purposes only here today. And so the Federal Fair Housing Act was passed originally in 1968. It made it unlawful to discriminate in housing-based transactions. And for our purposes today, that included in lending transactions. It made it unlawful to discriminate against somebody in a lending transaction if the reason for that differential treatment was due to their race, color, national origin, or religion. 1974 was amended to also include gender as an additional group. And then 1988, the act was amended to include families with minor children and people with disabilities as additional protected groups. And that's pretty much where the law stands here today. Indiana also has a state fair housing law that also protects against discrimination in lending as well. But what we're here to talk about today is redlining. And it all comes down to where you live. And let me show you how that is. Here is a graphic that was put together by the National Fair Housing Alliance showing just how housing is the center of so much in our life. And we at the Fair Housing Center argue it is the true center of our life. It allows you access to education, potentially which school districts your child may be able to get into, whether or not you will be able to afford to send your child to college. It, of course, is the main wealth builder for most Americans, the ability to purchase a home and invest in that home to build generational wealth, or wealth that one can access when they might need it for emergencies, repairs, healthcare needs, whatever it might be. Healthy environments depends upon where you live. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more here in a bit. Whether or not you have access to jobs, access to credit, I'm going to talk about that. Healthcare options, we certainly saw that during the COVID pandemic. In the neighborhood that you live in very well could be impacting your health. Access to healthy foods. Those of us who are here in Indianapolis certainly know there's been a pronounced effort around the number of food deserts that are in our community. Transportation, whether or not you have to have a car or whether or not you can get around. All is based upon where you live. There is a growing number of studies that have been showing how your zip code impacts your life. Researchers can, at the time of your child's birth, based upon your zip code, determine whether or not that child will graduate from high school, what they might earn, whether or not they will be incarcerated, all based upon your zip code. President Barack Obama said, in this country of all countries, a person's zip code shouldn't decide their destiny. My kids, another quote, my kids are starting at the starting line. They're starting 100 feet behind the starting line. The story of zip codes is a story of dreams stolen from children. That's the impact of housing. And currently, what is the state of home ownership here? Here are the US national rates as of 2019. The national rate is this pink line here. National rate is about at 65%, but whites much above that blue line here, remain fairly steady. Current at 2019 rates currently at just over 73%. But for blacks or African Americans, the lowest, the biggest gap between whites at only 43% as of 2019. This green line here, and you see a drastic drop coming out of the foreclosure crisis when it comes to blacks and African Americans. Hispanics and Latinos are at about 47.5%. They have been making grounds, but also lost home ownership opportunities after the foreclosure crisis, but are coming back at higher levels. Asian Americans are at 57.7%, definitely the highest of the race and ethnic groups, but still huge gap between whites. And then American Indian and Alaska Native at just under 51%. How do we in Indiana here do? Let's take a look at that. And this is off a new report that my organization released. Here in Indiana, when it comes to overall rates, let me start there. Again, Marion County, Indianapolis, 54%, state of Indiana at 69%, that national rate at 64%. But look at the rate for blacks or African Americans, 34%, even lower than the national rate. The state rate, 37%, and of course that national rate is 42%. The white rate, much higher, Marion County, 65%. Indiana, 74%, higher than the national rate at 72%. Here's the Hispanic breakdown, as well as for Asian Americans as well. And how is that trend? Looking at Marion County, we have seen since 1970, again, the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, but since 1970, all groups, including whites, although it was just slightly, have lost ground when it comes to home ownership. Let me repeat that. Everybody basically except whites, which basically held ground, have lost ground in home ownership rates since 1970. In particular, blacks and African Americans, who are the red line here, and this is Marion County data, went from almost a 49% rate in 1970, are now down to just under that 34% rate that we talked about. What has happened? The Fair Housing Act was supposed to stop discrimination. Is this all due to discrimination or are other factors at work? So what I'd like to do is show one of our videos that we have put together that talks about the history of redlining. And hopefully this moves perfectly here. Bear with me in me getting this going.
Part of section occupied by lower type Negroes. Portion is desirable residential neighborhood for better class Negroes. Almost solid Negro. Number of older German type citizens near Lutheran churches and schools. Very old type houses becoming occupied on the east portion by Negroes. Cheap class of property and citizens. Remarks like these were often listed on the Homeowners Loan Corporation map issued in 1937 for the city of Indianapolis. These city maps were created as part of a government-backed program that graded neighborhoods into 4 categories based in large part on their racial and ethnic makeup. Areas designated in red or yellow had the lowest ratings, while areas in green or blue had the highest ratings. Nationally, neighborhoods with minorities, Catholics, Jews, or new immigrants were marked in red, deemed undesirable, and given the lowest score. This later became the basis for the term redlining. These redline neighborhoods were areas that were viewed as high risk for new government-backed mortgages and mortgage lenders. This majority white Indianapolis neighborhood was labeled native white, executive, and other white-collar type, and given the highest green score for investment. A nearby majority white area was marked as blue, noting better class of Jewish race and no Negroes. Similar maps were issued for the cities of Evansville, Fort Wayne, Gary, Muncie, South Bend, and Terre Haute. Many do not realize that it was these government-backed programs and policies that caused today's neighborhoods to remain segregated and often high poverty. Let's explain. The federal government and private lenders denied minority communities access to good mortgage products that dramatically expanded opportunities for home ownership for whites. Unfortunately, these redlining effects lasted most of the 20th century. On top of redlining, restrictive covenants were used to ban the ability of people of color to purchase homes in many white neighborhoods. Here in Indianapolis, several white neighborhoods had such restrictions, often using language like, "No person or persons of any race or mixture thereof other than white race shall own, use, or occupy any lot herein, except in, however, a domestic servant, not of the white race, may occupy room or rooms with a tenant or owner belonging to the white race while in the employ of said owner or tenant." Discrimination in rental housing was also a major issue, further restricting housing access for many hardworking citizens. Although the U.S. Supreme Court eventually ruled these covenants were unlawful in the 1948 case Shelley versus Kramer, many continued to be unofficially enforced for several more years. The damage had already been done and would impact integration for generations to come. Back to redlining. The subsequent government-backed programs expanded access to mortgages and made them much more affordable. In the following decades, they assisted millions of white families in obtaining the financing necessary for home ownership and to gain wealth that white families who benefited have been able to amass and hand down to their children and grandchildren. However, minorities were systematically excluded from these programs. The imbalance created by redlining left minority communities with scarce options. They became subject to predatory and discriminatory land contracts that denied them the same opportunities white families had to accumulate wealth through housing. In white neighborhoods, the prospect of integration was used as a threat. Homes were then purchased at discounted rates under the guise of helping white people out before their homes lost too much value. This process was called blockbusting. Predatory entities then turned around and sold these houses to minorities through exploitive, one-sided land contracts. They also purchased homes in black neighborhoods for the same purpose due to the lack of credit available. Sales prices were unjustifiably inflated and interest rates were exorbitant, much higher than white buyers paid with their government-insured mortgages. Land contract buyers gained no equity, no matter how much they spent on their monthly payments and improving their homes, unless they made it all the way to the end of these predatory contracts. But most of them never did. It was a steep uphill battle designed for their failure. A 2019 report out of Chicago noted, over the 2 decades studied, the amount of wealth land sales contracts expropriated from Chicago's black community was between $3.2 and $4 billion. Today, we continue to see the harm of these discriminatory practices from over a century ago. The same red line neighborhoods in Indianapolis remain heavily segregated and often with lower incomes. These neighborhoods still lack jobs, banking branches, adequate sidewalks, and are often riddled with vacant homes that were foreclosed upon. The predatory lending of the foreclosure crisis added to the historical problems. An often bigger loss to those shut out of the home buying process is the inability to pass down the knowledge of homeownership to their children. With redlining and other forms of lending discrimination still happening today, there is a significant gap in home ownership between whites and people of color. There's still much to be done, but organizations like the Fair Housing Center of Central Indiana are working to stop discrimination in lending and ensure equal housing opportunities for all. To learn more, visit fhcci.org.
You are muted. I'm sorry. Could you unmute and please start over?
It was not letting me turn my mic back on, but sorry for that. All right. That video that this video, the history of redlining that we released that a couple years ago to try to get the information out about redlining. And Indianapolis is not unique. This was a problem across most major metropolitan areas. And those, as was mentioned in the video, other cities in Indiana also have those same redlining maps that were created. We also have a sales video that we put together last year that I'll drop a link in the chat when I'm done, that focuses mostly on the discrimination, the sales market, again, focusing on Indianapolis. as part of that. And I'll drop that into the chat. So when we look at this redlining map, and here's the one of Indianapolis. Again, there's other maps across Indiana. Here's the one of Indianapolis. And then you look at where African Americans live today. And this is as of the 2020 census. You can see overlap in kind of these same general areas. And that's the impact of segregation. That's the impact of those redlining policies, that racial covenants, all of which kept people out of so many neighborhoods. And we see this still today. Just last month, my organization released a report on mortgage lending here in Marion County. And we found that Black home seekers in Marion County were denied at a rate for mortgage loans of 22%, which was similar to the rates of denial for Hispanics as well at 21%, while whites and Asians were denied at rates about half that at only 12%. When it came to who actually got loans being originated overall of looking at the top 50 lenders in Marion County for the years 2018 to 2020, 3/4 of all originations went to white applicants, while only 12.7% went to Blacks, and less than 5% went to Hispanics as part of that. We also have seen a steady decrease in bank branches. In fact, Marion County and the state of Indiana lead national numbers in this area. The national bank branch closure rate in the United States was 16%, yet in Indiana it was 23%, and in Marion County it was 29%, nearly double the national rate. And when I'm done speaking, I'll drop a link to this report into the chat in case you want to read more. And how does this all come together? Well, those lack of opportunities, those lack in ability to be able to get loans to build that generational wealth, we're seeing the impact of that today. During the COVID pandemic, this became even more pronounced. Housing is health. Blood pressure rates increase depending upon where you live, and it's overwhelmingly in our neighborhoods of color. Asthma rates are higher in our neighborhoods of color as well, as is diabetes rates, also higher. These darker areas, also higher in our neighborhoods of color. Housing is healthcare and wealth. A 2007 study found that people mortgage their homes to pay down medical debts. We have a health insurance crisis, across our country. 62% of those who filed for bankruptcy did so due to medical debt, and most were middle-class homeowners that ended up losing their homes in that process. A 2008 study found that half of all foreclosures had a medical cause, and that put 1.5 million Americans at risk of the equity that they had built in their home, all because they got sick or were hurt. 78% of those at risk had health insurance, but were bankrupted anyway because in our country, health insurance is tied to employment. Housing as well. There has been a number of these studies that are coming out, but this is one from 2018, but there's some newer studies also that are coming out because of the interest in appraisal discrimination. But looking at our particular city here in Indianapolis, for those of us who live there, this study back in 2018 found that there was just under $20,000 difference. Now, the housing market has taken off since 2018, so it's much bigger. This 2018 report reported on average, there was about a $48,000 decrease for a home in a Black neighborhood than one in a white neighborhood, even when there's those homes, things like factors were taken into account, income levels, crime rates, all those type of things, there was still that $48,000 difference. And here's some additional information about how segregated our communities are. We're in the top 25 here in Indianapolis when it comes to segregated neighborhoods. You can go to this report and look at other cities in Indiana as well. And if you get a copy of my slides, I put links to the reports. That's what this kind of color is that you see there, and you can always just click on the link to get to the report. So I want to wrap up here with just last few slides. Housing is life. Marion County of the city of Indianapolis has the 19th highest gap in life expectancy rates, depending upon the neighborhood you live in. Thinking about that, just driving across Marion County, which on a very, very busy traffic day might take you 60 to 90 minutes to get all the way across the county. but you will go from 67-year life expectancy rate to 87 years, just based upon where you live. Housing is life. This is a staggering stat that was done after the foreclosure crisis that found that evictions and foreclosures result in higher suicide rates. 37% of deaths happened within 2 weeks of an eviction notice or of a court hearing. 79% of deaths took place before those individuals actually lost their housing. That loss of housing is impacting people's lives to such a significant degree. The Fair Housing Center of Central Indiana has been very active in trying to address lending disparities. As a fair housing organization, we investigate allegations of discrimination. We also do our own systemic-based work. In recent years, we have filed 2 actions against lenders alleging redlining violations and settled those cases. We've also assisted here more recently 2 Black women in filing complaints with HUD alleging a discrimination in appraisals. And then we also recently settled a case and have 2 other cases pending involving how lenders market and maintain their foreclosed homes in Black neighborhoods versus white neighborhoods. We've also had a couple cases dealing with rent-to-own or land contracts that was mentioned in the video as well. If you want to learn more about any of these cases, you can go to our advocacy page, which I will also drop into the chat. And then here's just some resources for you, some other videos we have. We have a very active website. And I will stop there and stop sharing my screen and then turn it over to April.
April DeSimone from Trahan Architects, take 2, right? Amy, thank you so much for grounding this information and making it Indiana specific. I'm going to have to get some assistance from Andrew or Michaela in the slides. I apologize again, folks. I don't know if it's the internet or if it's my laptop, but there is a huge lag in my presenting the slides. So if we can bring those slides up, Andrew or Michaela, that's super helpful.
I am going to try. What I have here is a PDF. I'm not sure if I can just share my whole screen. I don't know if you have a PowerPoint version that might help, but let me see if I can do that.
That's
perfect. We can see it.
Yes. And if you want to start at the systems of the environment, of the built environment slide, that would be super helpful.
Okay, let me get there and just let me know when to advance.
I'll say next slide. Thank you. So as I was discussing before I ran into some technical difficulties, a lot of the work that we're doing is really looking at contextualizing or interrogating the understanding of the built environment. How have we arrived at the conditions that, again, Amy and Dr. Wilson highlighted today? And what we begin to look at is, next slide, please. When we look at the human needs in the built environment, next slide, please. We look at housing, we look at education, we look at infrastructure, particularly now with this new infrastructure bill. All of this are what we mean by systems of the built environment. They're man-made, they're designed to create a response to human need. Next slide, please. As these systems are being created and built, next slide, what is it and who is it that is it being benefited by these systems? What we then begin to look at, next slide, please, is system influencers. How system accessors. How do we access these systems? How are they predicated on what Amy just shared? More curated and deeper histories. Next slide, please. So how is education and housing predicated on income? How does it determine the neighborhoods that we live in? Next slide, please. And as a result of having the access of these systems, we know that, again, spatial practitioners, many of you, whether you are an architect or a planner, next slide, please, or part of the philanthropic community or part of NGOs that focus on quote unquote affordable housing, all of you are making decisions that are informing the lived experience within the built environment. Next slide, please. When we, you can keep going, Andrew. Next slide. Just keep going. I'll tell you when to stop. I apologize for this. I'm so sorry. I have no, right here is fine. What we begin to look at when we see systems of the built environment is the understanding of how do we think? So redlining maps they didn't start under the federal government. The egregious part, again, as Amy highlighted, is that people who were put in positions of authority to steward the very ideologies and principles of our democracy, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and we the people, made intentional decisions based on a psychology of a human hierarchy, those who were deemed valuable and those who were not deemed valuable, based on false information, based on social conditioning. And as a result, that it becomes spatialized. It becomes spatialized in our segregated communities, and even how it represents itself today, how housing looks one way in one community and looks in another. And we know that all of these play a huge role in the disparate impacts of health and lived experiences. And we create collateral consequences as a result. So looking at systems of the environment, or having the agency to unpack that, or the right people at the table, becomes very, very important. That it's not just battles that are won in court, but that there are really a multiplicity of complexities that require the expertise and the professional understanding of how we're going to attack that. Next slide, please. You can keep going. So when we speak about perceptions and mental models, again, it's part of our framing, so that when we look at systems, how is the thinking happening? And again, we come from a curated history. I don't know how many of you are familiar with things like scientific racism and eugenics, but all of these play a role, particularly in the progressive movement of the early 20th century, of again, creating spatial imprints or geographical boundaries of who could live where, who was worthy of what. And this wasn't just exclusive to housing. Housing operates in a greater ecology. Next slide, please. Looking at perceptions and mental models, when we look at who has the power through relationships and connections, what is then the manifestation, next slide, from those perceptions to power that yield the policies, practices, and investments that, again, not only begin with redlining, but there is a whole history before redlining. And what is it that it creates in practices, such as restrictive deeds or racial covenants, or ways that we really, again, keep people at, again, this hierarchy of human value. Next slide, please. So in our work, as we look at this framing, we look at how we use our understanding. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, this is not. Next slide, please. So back to what Amy was saying, in 2015, we launched Undesign the Redline, an exhibition that has traveled the country, that really became an opportunity to bring different people who never come into a room together to have a conversation that understands the inequities that have been spatialized today are not something that just pop up overnight. The reality is that we, as practitioners, all of us, again, part of this seminar, are part of this bigger spatial manipulation and influence. And we inherit generational complexities that, again, without the right way to look at it, we run the risk of re-entrenching that same dynamic. In looking and using this tool as a medium, next slide, please, we begin to look at, again, back to what Dr. Wilson said, next slide, please, around these concepts of in the exhibition, we created a 16-foot timeline that really begins to build a narrative of how redlining happened. What were the sentiments, the perceptions, the climate that, again, yields at one of the biggest social safety nets of history that really provided what we essentially know as the American middle class, the opportunity for people to work hard and get a residual or a return on that investment. And what then happened after that? Next slide, please. We talked about the moral environmentalism movement, back to what Dr. Wilson was saying. Who is deserving, who isn't deserving, and how that predicated how we then even started to develop housing through tenement trajectories or beyond. Or as we move into, next slide, please. Again, we have, next slide, please. So when we look at the moral environmentalism movement and we look at these conditions, again, we start looking at where are these histories? What you're seeing in the screen in front of you, again, are the roots of when we begin to spatialize after the Civil War. This is the earliest 20th century, where we begin to understand the impact of the built environment and prosperity. And this is where I think is a crucial point in history, where we create a human hierarchy. We see that we use scientific racism, as you see in the center photo, to use science to begin to other, to create these stigmas or these stereotypes around identity. And it's all a social construct. It's not real. You also see the sentiments of immigration, Uncle Sam being consumed by then Irish and Asian influence, Chinese influences, because of this purity that is entrenched and again gets absorbed into spatial practice. On the right, you see Madison Grant. Madison Grant is celebrated as one of the major influencers of the environmental movement at his time, but he also writes a book called The Passing of the Great Race. So these are the perceptions. In that book, he begins to talk about who is supreme and who isn't, and who then is deserving of the very things that we're talking about that are basic human needs to survive. Next slide, please. As that thinking and that perception begins to build power, we see examples of how it becomes spatialized. So before redlining maps existed, we have residential racial ordinances passed in places like Baltimore. That's Mayor Mahul, that as one of the residents in an all-white community is inflamed that the first Black family moves in, the ordinance is passed to restrict the movement of people who are seeking decent housing, people who want the opportunity. And that is at the core of this, again, concept of democracy, that we have the opportunity to pursue happiness. And we see that every way and every opportunity has been stigmatized, and that it leaves imprints into communities as people begin to move out of spaces. So again, the advent of what we're dealing with today just doesn't start with the federal policies of redlining and the Federal Housing Administration, but it really is an entrenched system, which again necessitates the expertise to begin to unpack these spatial narratives. Please, when we look at from detrimental influences and people like Mayor Mahul, Andrew. We see how that thinking also becomes codified. What you have in front of you is a photo of Homer Hoyt. Homer Hoyt is celebrated as one of the innovators of the planning practices and land values, appraisal systems, which was at the core of the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Federal Housing Administration that really begin to use this land value. So what Homer Hoyt does is that as early, and this is embedded in the academic institutions, in his PhD program at the University of Chicago, he creates these appraisal systems, but he also includes in them that there are detrimental influences. Again, the language that Amy begins to highlight around how language shows up and then gets transformed spatially. And in it, he lists 10 ethnicities that are detrimental to have living in the neighborhood. And if you read them, it isn't just Blacks and Mexicans, as he's highlighting here, but it's a whole bunch of European ethnicities, again, who were deemed not to be this quote unquote social construct of whiteness at this time. And how this person then, next slide, please, is doing this as a dissertation, but ends up becoming the chief economist of the Federal Housing Administration under the New Deal. So of course, when we sit down at the table, he's not going to leave those ideologies at the door. He's going to codify them and entrench them into what he thinks and believes, along with everyone around him. So again, it really is how perceptions and power begin to translate into these policies, practices, and investments. So to have someone in this position who's making decisions that not only affected the time, but continue to affect us today, has really emphasized what we need to do as again, a community of folks that really want to create a very different understanding and stewardship of a democracy that is impeded by these deeper histories that manifest still today. Next slide, please. And again, we see how this translates not just from the maps, because the Homeowners Loan Corporation creates these maps that were way in existence before the federal government creates them. All the people, again, that have that mindset from these industries of the banks, the real estate, they are at the table within this administration. But then they remove the need for the maps and they begin to use the federal underwriting manual to codify the stipulations in which money is going to be lent into communities. And many of those stipulations enforce racial separation or segregation as a condition for investment into communities. And again, the egregious harm wasn't just into the urban cores of America, it really creates an implication into suburban America. And it creates the divisions of what we're dealing with today because of these boundaries that were reinforced by policies that, again, do not reflect democratic principles. Next slide, please. So as we see the Federal Housing Administration and urban cores dying, we see, again, even the quote that is on the screen, how it's not just the banks or the mortgage companies that are bailed out because of the 1929 market crash, which was the whole essence of creating the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Federal Housing Administration, because of the hemorrhaging, of the financial hemorrhaging. People could not be able to refinance their mortgages from 5 to 7 years, which were the typical terms back then. We create the 15 to 30-year mortgage under the New Deal, under HULP, under FHA. And as a result, we create them, again, the massive suburbanization of America. So everyone is profiting from this system. Again, the asphalt layers who are paving those roads out into the suburbs, the lumber industry, the rubber industry, everyone has their hand in the cookie jar, and no one is stopping to say there's something really wrong about how we're doing this, because this, again, is not reflective of these principles of we the people. And as we begin to segregate and, again, re-entrench narratives about othering and spectacle and stereotyping, next slide, please, we see neighborhoods torn through infrastructure, through highways cutting into them. We see that then the response to these communities is bring them to heel and get tough on crime, when we know that that's not the response that communities that have been disenfranchised, disinvested in by design. Again, what is our response to this, to this unraveling of a social fabric? It's broken windows. It's a myriad of other conditions. And you even see a quote here from Lee Atwater that the power and the perceptions are still translating in how we apply tax systems into America, how we create this, oh, you have to deserve, everyone's a welfare queen, or people take advantage. This is so, it's such a convoluted and chaotic conversation that it is the moment for us now to say, how do we do something different? Next slide, please. And then we get to neighborhoods today where now all this disinvestment is taking an about face. Next slide, please. And we are arriving at what we arrived to with places like Baltimore and beyond. Next slide, please. Where now the spatial speculation, so we come in land, what you buy, next slide, please. What you buy for land now is increased. Stop right there. So when we think of redlining, we are in the midst of the second redlining, because by sheer economics, again, back to Dr. Wilson's comments, who was in the labor force, even if we're entering at record numbers, the disparities are still existing. So to buy a home where investment is now being made in historically disinvested communities, by sheer economics, the displacement that is occurring or the inability to buy back in to those places resegregates those areas. So again, how do we look at policies? How do we look at what we're doing? How do we look at maybe home ownership in the traditional sense isn't what's fitting to really create these opportunities in neighborhoods? Next slide, please. How do we look at what we're doing in a different perspective, next slide, that really begins to heal these social fabrics of once intact communities that then become labeled as being unvaluable or as being unworthy. And then we continue to build these narratives and this moral environmentalism around, again, these concepts of deserving and undeserving and what we're trying to do. Next slide, please. So when we get to this point of knowing this, knowing that the very issues that we're dealing with today are predicated on deeper histories, was why myself and the founder of Trahan Architects, Trey Trahan, launched Designing for Democracy. Ourselves, along with a growing team of diverse stakeholders, are really understanding that there is an agency, not only from an architectural perspective internally, but externally, to create opportunities to convene different people that really understand what can we actually do to spatialize equity, healing, and justice beyond rhetoric, beyond just waiting for Congress to pass bills. And again, with the infrastructure bill in the pipeline, we are at a very pivotal moment to ensure that we don't recreate or re-entrench the same systems that many of us on this webinar purport to want not to do. Next slide, please. So we look at the agency to heal trauma-induced environments, that we know mental health is a growing issue. We know that architecture and design and spatial practice really has a role to play in creating healthier environments, not just from the point of or position of materiality, but even from the position of stress and self-worth and identity, to begin to deconstruct these spatial narratives that have, again, created a lot of conditions and chaos and friction within the built environment. Next slide, please. Healing is at the core of what we can do. Next slide, please. You can scroll through these, Bradley. Andrew, I'm sorry. Keep going. How do we reinvest back into our community? So our framework and what we do is that we look at 3 pillars. We look at pedagogy, we look at how pedagogy can inform process, and how process can inform spatial practice. And the interplay of these, we believe, again, situates back into how we change perceptions, power, policies, practices, and investments that then have a real impact in systems change. For us, if we don't know what the curated or spatial narrative is, then we are going to design or create based on that lack of knowledge. So what we're sharing now on this webinar, what Amy shared, Dr. Wilson's comments, and he embedded this understanding that we are not taught this in school. And then we go into our professions, into our occupations with an ideology that is very fractured and doesn't understand, again, the complexity of what we're dealing with. And then we reinforce this by just creating topical solutions that never get to the root to really change systems. And if we have the right pedagogy, then how processes can happen that go beyond a checkbox of community engagement, but really embed concepts like a neighborhood visioning strategy, long-term, to work organically within communities, to listen to different people, to bring different people together so that it stops these concepts of not in my backyard or the NIMBYism movement. By reframing even vernacular, because the minute you use the concept of the word of low income, you're reinforcing a spatial narrative that people connect to as being a certain person or demographic or identity. And it is the onus on us to change that. So within our framework and what we actively do with our projects is really understand how pedagogy, how to understand place, how to understand rootedness, transforms into a different process of how we work, not only within ourselves, with the client, but within community and beyond, that then really creates opportunities spatially that, again, are embedded with healing, equity, and justice. Next slide, please. So here's an example of how we take our framework and apply it. This was a NYCHA infill project. We know that public housing has been diminished, and what public housing did, again, to propel the middle class into other opportunities is a success story. But we have demonized public housing, particularly because of the competition with private interests, to make sure, and there's a history of private industry attacking and demonizing, and it's documented. It's not my opinion, it's there because it competes with the interests. But we, as again, as spatial practitioners and as people who consider themselves stewards of these ideologies and principles of democracy, must come to a table and say, you know, what are alternative housing models that we can look at? And with this one, with this project, you know, we explored what we can change. But public housing, again, carries a spectacle of stigmatization to it. Next slide, please. So what we had to do was begin to unpack that. So we worked first with the client and the client's internal team to really understand the history of space. What we showed was a curated transformation over time that embeds all of the policies that we talked about, all of the perceptions, all of the power that came into this place. It was profound to share this information or unearth this knowledge and give a very different understanding of this geographical footprint. What you had before public housing was built on this 6-block radius was actually an African American community, a Black and brown community that was a haven during the race riots of New York, the race draft riots of New York, but that there was actually land ownership models, cooperative ownership models within this area. That understanding begins to shift the stigma that when you look at the residents of public housing, what the conclusions you draw. But that this was not like this. And that these perceptions begin, again, with redlining, to devalue an area, to other an area, to really uproot. And you had what Jane Jacobs speaks of, the street life. You had small businesses every 2 blocks. You had a vibrant corridor that, again, when redlining labels these areas as hazardous, begins to create an understanding that these areas are not worthy of investment. And not only are they not worthy of investment, you're going to de-invest or disinvest in these areas. So what in this conversation with the client was to show just, again, how things show up. And then by the time we have the teeing up of this area of slum clearance and erasure of this community, public housing comes in. It's segregated at first, because like most of public housing in America was segregated and very few built for Black and brown communities. And when we begin to talk about the disruption of that clearance of a 6-block radius, the destruction that occurred, what the displacement, the environmental impact. So one of the first things we did was we looked at circulation pathways. How do you get people to cross the street again that not only are living in the public housing site, but need to cross over into other areas? How do you celebrate the green space within this site? So we looked at how to activate pathways again and circulation within the site that highlighted many of the artwork that was done by African-American artists with the WPA money under the New Deal, ironically, the same time when we create these redlining maps in the federal government. So from this understanding in opening up space and adding greenery, particularly with the heat island effects of urban, meaning how urban cores and more they're correlating with redlining maps, that because of the erasure of green space heats up and there are heat issues. And there's a great documentary that talks about the 900 people that died in Chicago, death by zip code, because again, the inequities that happen. Next slide, please. From looking at the circulation patterns within this infill project, we began to unpack with the client, well, what are opportunities that you can do within your scope of development here? And what we looked at was existing typologies. So one thing, for example, that they did have as programming the space for this new project was the creation of a food pantry or a soup kitchen. And what we began to do was to challenge, well, what is the story around food apartheid and food access? And we give this deeper understanding that when we create food pantries and soup kitchens, we reinforce again spectacle and hierarchy. That none of, like, it's going to limit who ends up accessing that location. And it's going to create a visual spectacle of the lining up outside, of, again, very undignified ways to meet food access issues. And what we proposed and worked with the client is, could you imagine if you shifted that? And there are models and examples that are popping up across the country that really create maybe a food cafe that now activates the circulation pathways so that we all get to cross the street and access. And it could be owned cooperatively, or it could be a local business owner that drives local economic impact. It could be the very residents of the community that have the culinary skills. But it's to think of how we spatialize, again, healing, equity, and justice. So equity creates business ownership opportunities, and we don't need to know who's there paying by eating and who is eating there with support. The point is that it creates a communal space that begins to blur those lines, and it offers other programming as well. But it's done in a way that I believe all of us would want to be treated if we were ever in a position of facing housing precarity or food hunger issues or food access issues. Next slide, please. What was really interesting, and again, we used precedents. We used Stuyvesant Town, which is the same typology of public housing and built at the same time, that have these activated spaces on the ground floors that really create not only for the residents of the space, but invites other people from the outside to utilize the cafe or the childcare center or the co-working space. So all of this adds vibrancy to really create a rebirth of connectivity. Again, restitching and healing of community. Next slide, please. So when we did this with the client, he just couldn't, he was blown away. He said no one in all the 40 years that they've been developing quote unquote affordable housing, that no one has really took them through this type of a process that really challenged them to see the potentiality, that it isn't a Herculean lift, to really begin to look at what they can do, but still be an advocate of future opportunities of what can develop, again, around things like limited equity, cooperative housing, and beyond. And it really, for us, creates an opportunity to look at how we look at the ecosystem of change, how that when we look at our interventions, how we can trace them all the way down to a root and say, are we actually changing the conditions of the built environment? And are we actually advancing concepts of equity, healing, and justice? And this is the opportunity that when we bring our framework through Trahan Architects and Designing for Democracies to work with clients, this is what we ground at the table. Because for us, it isn't just a cool thing to say we want to do this. In this moment that we are in, it is true to the ethos of our practice, because we do again believe that every one of us has agency to steward these ideologies of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness for all. And when we can do that together, we can make a resounding impact on and become precedents and case studies and examples to, again, allow democracy to truly flourish. Next slide, please. So in closing, there are a myriad of ways that we can start with self. What do we know? What can we change? What can we add value to even who we hire through our RFPs and contracts? Are they practicing the ethos of what we want to do? Or through what we donate to? Are we really getting the biggest bang for our buck? And again, when we begin to explore what's out there and who's doing what, these are examples that can be crafted and integrated into what you do daily. Because we want to see a picture where places that hold symbols of our democracy are flooded with people celebrating what that democracy represents and changing for future generations, that when they get up every single day, what does democracy say to them? Thank you so much.
Well, thank you both so much for such a powerful presentation and statement. Thanks to everyone for sticking with us, making it work through different technical challenges. We definitely have a little bit of time left. Would like to hear what questions people have. Please feel free to make those known either in the chat or if you're able to come on yourself. Let me just start off with a broad question for you both. So for the practitioners who are among many of the people who are attendees today, how can they embed some of these lessons in their day-to-day work? And maybe also let me challenge you, like what's a systemic solution that some of the attendees here should carry forward, and how could they approach that?
Do you want to start, Amy, or I'm happy to take the question? Was it addressed to me, Andrew? I'm sorry.
Really to both, yeah, and it's meant to be very broad.
Okay. Amy, why don't you finished off and I can add to what you say.
Yeah, I mean, for us, we are always looking at everything from a fair housing perspective. So in answering that question is we need to have better enforcement of fair housing laws. The Fair Housing Act is a truly phenomenal law, but it's never had the full support of government, legislative, judicial branches to enforce it as needed, to root out the modern day forms of discrimination that is happening. And then we need to have a candid conversation about how do we address the historic disparities that were there. Just because the Fair Housing Law was passed in 1968 did not mean that, first of all, discrimination stopped or everybody then was on the same playing field at that point. So candid conversations about how to address those inequities, reparations may be part of that discussion. We may need to, some cities are already exploring items such as that, but we're not going to get there simply by doing what we've been doing so far. There needs to be more acknowledgement of the problem and more ways to try to address it.
I agree. I think, and also the exploration has to be part of a tailored process, right? Like knowing this information, we've all, a lot of people are under the false understanding that in 1968, we erased all the discrimination that has happened. So right now we are, again, in a pivotal moment. I go back to these concepts of neighborhood visioning centers, Andrew, like where do we invest in a space where people can really begin to understand the ecology of what's around them, that really invite, like a public library meets a design center, to really begin to distill what are the systemic issues of the area. We know that housing prices are predicated on land values. If we know this, what are opportunities to create real estate investment trusts that are specifically geared for preservation of land that is used to respond back to what has happened historically and creates a different future of what can happen and what then the opportunity of what can we build on there. Home ownership, again, doesn't necessarily need to be this concept of owning a single family home. There are beautiful models like Amalgamated in the Bronx, New York, that practice concepts of limited equity cooperative. What does that mean? It allows for diversity to stay in place so that if you buy something for $10,000 or $15,000 and you're given security and the ecology around you, right, it's not just housing, it's the school, it's amenities, it's all the things you're gonna need to really be your best self are invested in. It's a different type of homeownership model. And it really begins to destigmatize this concept of the quote unquote low income renter, which is very problematic in our society. So we have, again, enormous opportunity here to really look at land systems, look at education systems, but we need to have the right people at the table that are prodding and poking us to look at things differently.
Thank you. I do want to do a quick time check. Our next session actually starts at 11:30. So I want to give people a chance. First, I posted the survey. Please take just a moment to finish that. And then we want to land the plane and give people a little bit of a chance for a break. But there are now a couple of new questions in the Q&A. So both April and Amy, if you would take a look at those and maybe choose a question each to answer. And I think that'll be a good way for us to wrap up.
Sure. I'll add quickly, vernacular for me is how we word things, how we attach our definitions to structure, to infrastructure, to what we're creating in the built environment. So if we attach the word low income, affordable housing, they have been bastardized in a way that creates a stigma or understanding around it. And we need to begin to change that. Housing is housing. So that's when I speak of housing or vernacular, poverty, poor, all these words that we use, it can really create a spatialized narrative for a structure with the very good intentions behind that structure. It's still going to create an othering. So we need to think about more how we can do that. As far as the food apartheid question in the built environment, well, we know that food apartheid did not just happen overnight. And what gets replaced in these areas are unhealthy options. But what we can really begin to look at again is how do we translate into the case study I showed you, how do we transition from a food pantry or a food bank or a soup kitchen to really, again, food centers that invite communal eating, that invite people maybe that are not a single mom or a mom that can't cook dinner, that she can go there. And it's like a cafeteria style place, but those who are addressing or don't have the resources to do it are also able to eat there. But the point is that you're not doing it from a position of spectacle, that you're reconcentrating the identity of the only people that can eat there. So it's really trying to use space to really create fluidity and address issues, systemic issues of food access and apartheid in ways that are more innovative and are really more respectful to the demographics whose conditions are, again, predicated on deeper histories.
Looks like the other questions in the chat are actually directed at April. I will just very quickly say that stay tuned. In April, the Fair Housing Center, Central Indiana, will be hosting a redlining exhibit at the Central Library. We'll be announcing that as it gets closer. We're going to bring our videos that we have created to life through a several panel exhibit. And I would encourage, I dropped the link in the chat, everybody to take a look at April's exhibit. You can look at it virtually, and it's just a phenomenal piece of work that's been put together.
Well, thank you both for such a wonderful presentation. Just to remind the attendees, we will have those presentations available as well as the video here. But let me give folks a chance to take a quick break because our next session starts in 5 minutes at 11:30. So thank you all. Bye.
Thank you. Take care. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thanks again. Bye.